Thanks, Peter, and thanks GRDC and FACEI Group for giving me the opportunity. One thing that AEGIC can never do enough of is to come and speak with growers. We're not a big enough machine to get enough national coverage to do that, but when we do get the opportunity, it's always good to do it. So I'm going to talk about just a light touch on how AEGIC goes about its work, and then give you the shape of what are the market signals and market drivers that we see. I have taken out a bunch of stuff on the East Coast domestic market, so I'll just talk in general terms about that. There is some relevance for WA, so I'll mention that. And then just give some specific examples of what AEGIC's doing in our projects, and that's about sort of trying to give you an idea of the sort of thing that we do. The detail is not so important as understanding the sort of nature of stuff that we take on. So just to explain the way that AEGIC operates, if you think about this as the face of a clock, from 12 until 3 is where we send people who have got good connections into the markets. They go up there and listen to our customers and understand what are the risks and opportunities that you as a customer are experiencing, you know, when you're buying Australian grain. Sometimes they're people who are not buying it yet, and we want to understand what are the market requirements and what would they be interested in, or what do we have to do to make them a buyer, that sort of thing. We'll then bring that back, and our economics people and our analysts will measure up, you know, what's the size of the prize, what's Australia's ability to deliver an answer here, and then prioritise those. We have to crap test that with our stakeholders around Australia to make sure the customers are not just selling us a pup, but once we understand it and establish our priorities, we then move into the labs, and that's where the cereal chemists and the food scientists build an evidence-based solution that we can take back into the market. So quite often these are applying known principles. A lot of it's not, you know, new science. And it might be something like baking 1,000 loaves in our test bakery, assembling a data set, and then between 9 and 12 we'll take that back into the market. We'll have, for example, the 20 biggest bakeries in Indonesia in an R&D centre, and we'll do a 3-day workshop with them, hands-on, showing them. You know, the Americans, after the Second World War, populated Southeast Asia with American baking technology, and they've got them brainwashed that you have to buy expensive high-protein wheat to be able to make bread. So we go up there and say, well, actually, if you do it this way, which is, you know, the rapid method that we use here in Australia, you can make perfectly fine bread. You don't have to buy the expensive stuff from the US or the rubbish from Russia. You know, you can save yourself close to $60 a tonne if you're buying wheat out of Australia to add to your baking grist. So that's sort of how we do it. Just to give some context, you know, in any business there's only 3 ways to compete: price, quality and service. So AEGIC takes a whole of industry approach to this, and when we had the droughts 3 and 4 years ago, price wasn't working. You know, we had no grain to sell overseas really, and we had the most expensive wheat in the world. So the trade side had nothing to talk with the customers about. So that was the time for AEGIC to step forwards and to put the value proposition in front of the customers, even at a time when they're not a buyer. So someone needs to be talking to your customers when we're not a seller or when they're not a buyer. So, you know, it's AEGIC's role to step to the front. An example here, you know, we were investing about $750,000 a year on the Indonesian market. When the droughts were on, we upped that to more like $1.2 million a year, just because someone needed to be flying the flag. And the lowest they got to was 900,000 tonnes of imports. The very next year, as soon as we had grain to sell again, they went straight back up to 5 million tonnes. You know, so they understand the value of using Australian grain, and someone's got to be there flying the flag for us. We're super lucky by the nature of our investment from DPERT and GRDC that we're actually tasked with taking a long-term strategic view of the market. So some of the projects that I'll talk about later on are going to take a while to run, but you know, it's really important. The trade are never going to do this, right? The trade are only ever one or two transactions in front of themselves. So someone has to be looking out, what's the next opportunity, where's the competition coming from, what are they going to take off us, or what gaps are we going to open up for ourselves. And the sooner we can establish a priority, the more efficient we can be in moving things through that funnel, and the more wastage we can prevent. You know, because working out that something's a bad idea, that's pretty handy as well. You can forget about it and stop wasting money on it. So just to give some context around the East Coast, so it took us 20 years to get from 20 million people to 25, so that happened in 2020. With immigration and other things, the next 5 million to get from 25 to 30 would only take 10 years. So by 2030, we think there'll be 30 million people in Australia. COVID's probably interrupted that a little bit. So when that happens, most of them are going to live in the East Coast, and it'll mean that the supply and demand will be in equilibrium on the East Coast. So given climate change, more regular drought events and, sorry, how do I go backwards? So, you know, this gap here is what we'll be seeing, something like 2.5 million tonnes a year in deficit just in New South Wales when they have those drought events. So you're talking maybe 3 years out of 10. So they'll be more frequent with climate change and bigger in their impact because there's no spare grain on the East Coast by 2030. So, you know, there's every chance that WA will become an exporter to, and SA, an exporter to the East Coast on a more regular basis. So we need to have a think about the logistics of that. And for us guys over here, we probably also need to understand that price elasticity of the East Coast to be able to know when it's going to work and when it's not. So just looking into the export markets now, which is where most of Western Australia's grain goes, I think, you know, these things are pretty well understood. You know, in most of our markets, people are growing up in the country. That's where the rice produced. It's pretty cheap. They move to the city, get themselves an education and become wealthier. And when they do that, first they'll eat less rice, they'll add a noodle product to their diet, they'll add a bakery product to their diet, they'll eat more meat, those sort of things. So, you know, that's a significant driver of demand. So urbanisation, just flat out population growth, you know, another 200 million mouths just across our biggest markets by 2030. Wealth and then convenience as they want to eat a more Western style diet, which I'll explain a bit later on. So this is some work that MLA did about, it was in China, about how the customers there perceive the Australian farmer. So we don't have the big hats here in WA, but you know, honest, kind, down to earth, trustworthy, natural. So, you know, what that really means is that they have trust in our production systems and trust in our supply chains, and they understand the credentials that you guys bring to the table in the production systems that we use here in Australia. Have we done a good enough job to extract some value out of that in those markets? Maybe not. Maybe there's an opportunity coming with the sustainability push. So the shape of the markets, you guys know this fairly well. Obviously, freight advantage into Asia and into the Middle East, and the last couple of years that's also been working down the east coast of Africa too. So countries like Tanzania, Kenya have become consistent buyers. Obviously the Ukraine situation's changed the shape of that as well. So just across our biggest markets, there's another 15 million tonnes a year in demand growth by 2030. We're exporting nationally maybe 18 to 22 million tonnes a year in wheat. So, it's almost our entire export task currently, doubled by 2030. So, the demand side is very strong, both domestically and in the export markets. And when you look at specifically where that goes, big story here in how much the feed market's growing, much faster than the food market. And then when you look at the market segments, not much happening in instant noodle or in fresh noodle, a lot more in bread. But the really interesting one is the cakes, cookies, crackers, that market segment, which we're going to have a look at. So I mentioned convenience as a market driver. So, people in the urban centres are working in office blocks, maybe they've been educated overseas, they're in a professional job, they've got a briefcase over one shoulder, they've got a couple of devices that they're juggling, and they're using public transport to get into work. And it's really hard to eat rice or noodles with your spare hand, right? So I'm a bit dirty that the Americans coined the phrase, but they call it one-hand eating. I wish we had a thought of that. But what these people are doing are grabbing a muffin or a sandwich or a cake or a granola bar or something on the way to work, something that they can eat with one hand in their busy lifestyle. And then they're living in an apartment, so they don't really want to cook, so they want things that are pretty well ready to eat. So, that's a whole new market segment that hasn't been there that long, that's a critical driver of demand, and it's a high value market segment as well. So I talked a bit about the shape of the market and the demand side. So, the numbers are fairly compelling. Strong growth in demand for wheat, and then there's other products that are starting to come into their diets, like plant proteins, but more importantly, some of the factors that are shaping the demand side. One of those is health. So half the heart disease in the world lives in Asia, in our markets. A third of the world's diabetes. So, these are epidemics in these countries. We're doing some work in two of our projects, one in oats and one in whole grain wheat, to try and connect, rather than connect through the customer, but actually to connect through the health side of their governments and say, well, if everyone was eating their 2 slices of brown bread a day, here's how much you could be saving your health system. That work's been done. In Australia, it's about $1.4 billion a year here. So you multiply that out across the populations in those Asian countries, and it's a lot of money that they could be influencing with better diet choices. And the reason we're interested in whole grain and in oats for those markets is, whole grain products, you can't really make them from the red wheat that's grown in the rest of the world. They really only work with white wheat. There's flavour problems with red wheat in a whole grain application. So, here's an opportunity to use a health epidemic to create an ongoing point of differentiation for white wheat in Australia, from Australia, in a high value market segment. So everyone's talking about sustainability. The market's been talking about it for about 3 years now. They don't know exactly what it is. All they know is that the consumers these days are not getting their information from the people who are trying to sell them things. They're getting them independently, evidence-based, off their phone, making a decision based on their own research. My kids do it. You know, a simple thing, we're going out for a burger, Dad, where are you going? Yep, we've had a look, we're going here for this reason. Consumers are factoring a whole range of different things into that decision making as they gather that evidence. So it's no longer just price versus quality like it has been. You can add in there now things like food safety, health and nutrition, environmental credentials of the production system, carbon emissions, water footprint, food miles, ethical employment. All of those things are now in their consideration set. So the aggregation of those individual behaviours are the new shapers of demand. So we see manufacturers putting up sustainability platforms, pillars if you like, and they're a combination of what they can do and what they think they might be able to hear from their customers. So what we need to do, we haven't done it yet, we need to get into the market and gather evidence-based primary data on the sustainability factors and how they're impacting on the shape of demand, because once we understand it, we can then bring that back, share it with the industry. So here's what our customers are asking for, here's current practice. Where there's a gap, we then need to have a conversation about, well, would we, could we, should we do it? Are they going to pay for it? You know, trying to balance access to practice and chemistry versus market requirements. But until we know what it is and we're literate in it, we can't start to have that conversation. So there's a key piece of work to be done there. We're co-investing with GRDC into our first little step. That's just looking at the claims on labels that are being made in our markets. We need to get a step past that and actually get it right from the consumer's mouth. And then all of the work that you've seen, you know, GGL have done some, GRDC have done some, we'll be able to have a look at what the gap is and work out what we can address and what we're going to get paid for and what we need to make sure we retain access to as far as chemistry or practice goes. I'll put this slide up. It's sort of a bit of an ass-about way to say it, but I just wanted to show the lengths that China's going to make sure they've got supply. So their Belt and Road program, this is a $600 billion investment to make sure they retain food security. Countries like Japan and Korea have tax-free windows for their companies to invest outside of their country to shore up supply. So I can take you to Indonesia and show you port assets and things that are built and owned by Korean and Japanese companies who are doing that to make sure they can access the raw materials they need. Here we are, you know, an export country. Surely there is a role in developing a model where Australian companies are rewarded to create demand. So I think that, you know, this is worth understanding. We don't want to be just stand in the market, here's what I've got to sell. So, you know, if you think about it, Australia can only feed another 60 million people after we feed ourselves. There's 650 million in ASEAN. There's another 2.5 billion between India and China. So which 60 million do we want to feed? You know, sure, these are poor countries that are going to need access to cheap food, but we've also got some choice within the segmentation of those markets to try and aim for the higher value end of it. So here's some work we've been doing for 4 years now on seeing, I mentioned earlier how fast the market segment in cakes and crackers and cookies is growing. So we've been in the market and understood what the customers are seeking. We've done some collaborative research with them, showing them what we've got now, and that's in order to understand how it performs. Did you guys grow soft wheat here, or it's probably just a bit further south? Here as well? Yeah, okay. So I think I was down in Albany. I reckon we got the last load of soft wheat in about 2004 or 5, and the decision was made from Deep Herd side that a 300,000 tonne a year market was not enough to sustain a breeding program. So it all sort of stopped. Well, that's now close to 6 million tonnes a year, and the Yanks have got it all to themselves, which sort of gives me the irrits, because when I look at it, we used to have some pretty good soft varieties. It's low protein, which we're good at. Below 9, 7 would probably be better. So I'm not too clever on the agronomy side, but I've had a play with the GRDC's nitrogen calculator, and I figure aiming for 9 instead of 10.5 protein, you're probably going to save $25 or something in inputs. So maybe there's some advantage there. The breeders are on board. So 3 years ago, it was only long reach. They were investing about 120 grand a year. You've now got both Intergrain and AGT spending north of $500,000 a year on new varieties. Richie's helped us out. I think we've got 3rd year trials in the ground now, and have been doing the testing on how the quality stacks up. And it's looking okay. We're pretty close, and the breeders are fairly confident that they can get us to varieties that are going to be competitive. And if you look at the logistics and the freight advantage of an Asian customer being able to buy 1 hatch of soft wheat and fill the rest of the boat up with their normal ASW, APW blend, there's big savings in that for them, not having to manage the inventory. They're probably saving $30 in freight, not having to get it from Portland, Oregon in America. So I think it can work. I think it will happen. There's definitely market support for it. The breeders are confident. We're pretty confident. And I think it's a good thing for WA, an opportunity to take a slice of market share that we should be able to hang on to, because the growth has got plenty of legs left in front of it. So in oats, what we love about oats is the health story that goes with it. So I mentioned about heart disease and diabetes earlier on. Oats is very well known. Its credentials in reducing those diseases is very well documented. If you have a look at the market shape, so here we're eating 4.5-5 kilos a year per person. China's eating 500 grams, Indonesia's eating 200. So there's lots of space left. Even if they only got to a kilo a year, that would it would soak up everything we can grow. So what can we do to make the take up quicker and create that demand side pull? Well, the thing is, not everyone's in love with porridge, right? So our thing is how do we innovate, use our food scientists to create Asian style products. So we've got an oat rice equivalent, we've got 100% whole grain oat noodles developed. They're in an advanced stage of commercialisation. They should, get onto the market within the next 12 or 18 months or so. And then there's a pipeline that starts to get really interesting when you look at things like infant formula and some value adding to the beta-glucan fraction, into high value products like salad dressings and pasta sauces and that sort of thing. So this is about changing the way the product's consumed so that it's not just a breakfast thing, but in the Asian market they can be eating it at lunchtime or at dinner time and creating a lot more pull. So Southeast Asian feed, you remember I mentioned that the feed market's growing faster than the food market. So across just Southeast Asia, it's about 65 million tonnes a year. Just to give some idea of scale, CP, based in Thailand, is the biggest feed miller in the world. They do 100 million tonnes of product a year, right? So it's big business. Think about the size of it. We're eating about 21 or 22 kilos of chicken a year per person. Indonesia's eating about 7. Right, so as their diets westernise and their wealth enables it, their consumption will go up. There'll be huge draw on demand. So 2016, we could see the concentration risk with barley going into China, and we thought, look, we've got to get the message out to the rest of Asia that barley's good feed. So, you know, the Americans have brainwashed them that animals can only eat soybean meal and corn. Well, you know, all our chooks down home, they did pretty well on seconds and barley and, you know, a few yabby heads and that sort of stuff. But there's just a gap in their technical knowledge. So, you know, over that time, we've taken feed nutritionists up into the market and shown them formulations that, you know, you can use Australian low quality wheat or you can use Australian feed barley. Here's how the price comparison to corn works. And across markets like Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, in those 4 years, this market has gone from taking 0 feed barley to close to 2 million tonnes a year. Right, so you can have an impact for a fairly modest investment just by filling a technical gap and showing them how the profitability works. So, you know, that's the sort of thing that we can do to have an impact in our markets. Pulses, you know, the yellow pea wet process that they're using in Canada, China, France is using about as much water as beef cattle. So if Australia's going to create an industry here, I don't think it's sustainable for us. We don't have the access to the water to be able to do that. So this is just a small program of ours over in the Sydney office. We've done some collaboration with Charles Sturt University in their, what was their program called? Do you remember, Richie? I nearly had it. Anyway, they had a research vehicle set up which we were inside of, Functional Grain Centre, that was it. So we've taken out of that the IP around dry processing through air classifications. So if you've got a stream of product falling this way and a stream of air that way, it'll fluidise and you can take out the fractions that you want. So, you know, we think that's a much more sustainable option for Australia. We've got some people interested. We've just hooked into the Global Linkages program as well through Sydney Uni, which has some of the, well, Rockwet is probably the biggest global pulse protein producer in the world. So I think two things. There is some work going into learning how to grow soybean in Australia. You know, that's important. Equally important is we have to learn how to process the stuff that we can grow, including lupins. So, you know, there's a lot of work still to be done here. You just think about the water stuff. You know, the hippies that eat this stuff think they're doing the planet a favour to eat a plant protein, but if it's using as much water as beef cattle, that's quickly going to go out of favour. So, Australia needs to have a think about that. So just some future opportunities. I've just spoke about the pulse piece. Understanding those long-term drivers all the way from the consumer, super important. Until we do that, we can't make the decisions that are connected to the market requirements that we need to in sustainability and have a choice about how we engage with that. What bits do we want to be in? What bits can't we do? What bits don't we want to do? And then market shaping. So India Malt is a good example here. We've been working there for 3 years. The Austrade side did some good work with the local industry there and showed us the opportunity around malt barley. So the technical piece is done. We've had the experts up there. We've shown them how to use Australian barley, why it's more profitable to use it than their own 6-row or the rubbish that they're getting from France. That market is primed, ready to pump. There's just 2 little weed seed issues to take care of. I think there's a delegation coming out in a month or so to have a look at how we manage that. And there's 500,000 tonnes of new market for our malt barley ready to go. So our job is to keep looking for those opportunities and doing the technical piece to make sure when the door opens up, they're ready to go. So just to finish, thanks for your patience. So my key messages is just that it's AEGIC's job to take the long-term view. The story for you guys around the demand side is very positive, both export and domestic. We don't really understand what the logistics of that might look like from west to east, but we'll work it out. Feed, we don't need to think of feed anymore as stuff that's damaged or that we can't sell anywhere else. It's a viable part of the market, and we should be looking for how we can grow feed grains that are going to perform in the market. The consumer preference bit, I've probably done that to death. Health and nutrition is an important shaper of demand, and we need to understand it. There's a lot of dollars on the line in our customer countries that we can hook into as a way to create demand. And you guys are doing a bunch of things well and right that go to your credentials around producing a clean and green product. Our customers understand that, but we can always do more work to try and make sure we get better leverage out of that. And they trust it. Every conversation we have in market starts with clean and green. It's well understood by the market. So, I think growers deserve to be applauded and rewarded for that. So, thanks for the opportunity, and happy to have a chat at Smoko or some questions. Yeah.
G'day, Rich. Different question from last week, but around feed barley. So you had a graph up there, a graphic of where all the wheat goes.
Yeah.
Feed barley is a bigger product in this area than, or barley is a bigger product in this area than wheat. Where are the major markets from there? You mentioned some Southeast Asia feed.
Yeah.
And how interesting will it get if China comes back in the market?
Yeah. So if you think about it, China was taking about 3.5 million a year between feed and, FAQ, cheap malt. So when that tariff closed the door for us, the traditional market for feed barley was always Saudi, around about 7 million tonnes a year consistently. And we've been in and out of that. Back in the grain pool days, it was a regular market. So a lot of it's gone into Saudi, But the 2 million tonnes that's going into Southeast Asia has been selling about 22 bucks a tonne better than Saudi, because that's the lowest price tender in the world. So there's value in having that diversification. Otherwise, it'll just flow to the lowest common denominator. And if you win in the business on price, you've already lost. Right. So hence the value of trying to have those little chunks. So if China comes back, then there's 2 million tonnes a year right on their doorstep that they're going to have to work a bit harder to buy, because they'll have competition from Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand for that same grain. So yeah.
One of the things I understand that the US Wheat Associates does is a lot of crop modelling. So as the wheat crop is growing, they inform their customers, how many acres or hectares over there and quality, so that they can set their machines up to perfect the art of making that awful white stewed Kleenex bread that they try and get people to eat. Is that the kind of thing that AEGIC, who's likely to take that on?
Yeah.
We create demand for particular soft wheats, then how do you model that and show what's being grown and the quality profile?
Yeah, so we do it. Not so much through the year, but once the harvest is in. One of the constraints for us is that we don't have access to a data set. So, that's been an ongoing debate in the industry. What we do get is the bulk handlers will share us their data after they've had first use of it. So February, first week of February, they'll be aiming to go into market and talk to at least their biggest customers about seasonal quality, and we generally get access to it, so we can be up there in, say, April. But the biggest selling has pretty much happened by then. What we can do, and what we do, is provide them a lot of advice through the growing season around production conditions, and we can have a conversation about that's predictive of the quality. So you may have seen our crop videos that we push out. We'd probably do 4 webinars a month as well, just getting in front of the customers with the value proposition message. Yeah.
Just a quick one. Lupins, is there much work going on with lupins, since they're our biggest legume crop in WA?
Yeah, did Gary load you up with this one? Because that's what he got me last week. So we have done some feed work in lupins. We've been putting that information into the market around dairy and swine. But on formation, AEGIC was constituted to work in wheat, barley and oats. So we know we've got to move into lupins. We're getting a lot of pressure from our 2 members, but the reality is that we haven't been set up to have that capacity, so we're going to have to do less of something else and do some work in lupins. I think Deep Herd in particular are doing a bit of foot stamping at the moment to make sure we do that. So,
Richard, you mentioned about the Americanisation of the nutritionists and that, and we have the same issue with the animal nutrition.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a scope for maybe GRDC or someone to train the nutritionists here in Australia and subsidise them, because they're very American-fied? They go towards corn and soybeans, especially on the animal side of things, and lupins is a big option, but they just don't know or understand it, and maybe there's got to be a education of all those nutritionists and funnel down into our universities here.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I've been talking a bit to GRDC about it just recently. The great example is what the US have done with DDGs in America. So it's been probably 3 or 4 years now. And they've had a really concentrated effort. So there's a guy up there who has a high profile in the feed industry. MCs all of the feed conferences, Puck Modi. So the US engaged him, and then they set up regional 2-day training programs with not just nutritionists but also owners. You know, and they've taken that DDG market from 0 to 1.5 million tonnes in 3 years. Right now they're in Vietnam trying to do the same thing, you know. So it's a model that works. We don't have the balance sheet depth to be able to do it at that level, but I think it's worth having a crack at least you know, have the conversation, because you can make change when the intervention's very targeted.
Okay, that's all we've got time for,
No worries.
Richard, today. But Richard will be around through morning tea time,
Yeah,
so please continue speaking with Richard during that time.
No worries.
Look, you've led a relatively small organisation that does a huge job, which is marketing and product development for the whole of the Australian grains industry. So well done. Thanks for today, and
mate.
thanks for your efforts.
No worries. Thanks, Pete. Thanks.